the Department of Sociology, and the Population Studies and Training Center. She's a triple UNC alum and did her bachelor's degree in sociology here, as well as predoctoral trainee through the Carolina Population Center. And then finally, she did her PhD in sociology here as well. So thank you so much for returning to Chapel Hill for us. We're glad that we're important enough. And with that, I'll let you talk.
Thanks. I talked to Clark about this talk before he decided exactly what to do. And I gave him two choices, so if you don't like what you get, it's his fault. I gave him two choices, one of which was you get the polished talk on the thing I've been working on for like 3 or 4 years about agricultural intensification in Brazil that's like all done and all published and beautiful, or you get to talk about the thing that's right in the beginning stages. And so I wanted to do the thing in the beginning stages, which is what I'm giving you here, which means that there are a lot of things I don't know, and there are a lot of things that I would love to hear people's comments on, and I've already talked to a number of students here about some of the things that we have in mind, and I just think I'd love to have any input in it. The other thing that I want to say about this is my recruitment photo. So this is my study area. It's just inland from this gorgeous beach here. So my students, when they go, and students and postdocs, when they go, they all rent houses in this little town that's on the beach. So it's a really,
What's the name of the city?
this is in a little town called Serra Grande, which is right near Ilhéus in Bahia. So it's a beautiful area, and very safe, notwithstanding the fact that my postdoc just got mugged and her laptop stolen, but it was a really low-key mugging, just her laptop got stolen, nothing bad happened to her. So this is, so the first thing to say is that this is a super collaborative project, and it's it reflects our commitment in the team and at Brown to mentoring and interdisciplinary collaboration and multi-career stage collaboration. So we've got the two PIs at Brown are Stephen Porter, who's an ecologist, he's a biogeochemist, and then myself, trained as a sociologist. We have postdocs on the project. Emerson has a PhD in demography from Brazil. Justin has a PhD in forest ecology. Kira has a PhD in environmental science. And Joy has a PhD in ecology. And then we have currently 3 PhD students from sociology, and then we have a series of undergraduates who are going to the field and writing their theses and doing a variety of research assistant tasks as well as independent research. And then we have collaborating teams at an NGO, which is our local implementing NGO called Instituto Floresta Viva, which is a socio-ecological development NGO in the region, and at the state university, which is the kind of lower tier universities in Brazil, at the state universities, and then the federal universities, which tend to be the kind of more research-oriented universities, and then a place called the Climate Policy Initiative, which is actually an international policy think tank, and we're working with their Rio office. So it's a big group of people, and very collaborative and very interdisciplinary. And I'm clicking on this thing, and it's doing nothing. Dun, dun, dun.
You need a button pusher?
Sam
is a great button pusher.
It's also a remote control thing, mouse, I think. So let me just bring the mouse over here. Thank you. Not that I don't want you to push my buttons, Sam.
I do it well.
So I get to joke with Sam because he almost came to graduate school to work with me, but he didn't. He decided you guys were better. So this is, I wanted to start by talking about how this is a, and now miraculously you fix the button. And so I wanted to start by talking about how this project is framed within this kind of global pivot away from a focus on deforestation and towards a focus on reforestation. And so just a couple of pieces of evidence on this. So globally, in 2011, there was this agreement called the Bonn Challenge, which is a global aspiration to restore 150 million hectares of degraded and forested lands. Within the 2015 Paris Conference of the Parties Climate Agreement, the parties are encouraged to a bunch of other stuff that includes reforestation and restoration of degraded lands. One of the Sustainable Development Goals put forward in 2015 was to increase afforestation and reforestation. Within Latin America, there's an initiative that is run by the World Resources Institute called the 20 by 20 Initiative, which is to bring 20 million hectares of degraded land in Latin America and the Caribbean into restoration by 2020. And within that 20 by 20 initiative, Brazil has committed to 12 million hectares of reforestation by 2020. We can talk about how reforestation is defined here, because obviously 12 million hectares of reforestation by 2020 is a bit ambitious, and so they go somewhat broad definition of reforestation. So within Brazil's INDC, within the international climate commitments, they've committed to zero net deforestation, so they've committed to reforestation to offset any deforestation that's happening. And so we have this pivot in the international community towards reforestation, which also provides a kind of really interesting scientific point of leverage. So we've been doing a lot of research in the last decade or so on how to get people to stop deforesting. But getting people to stop doing something year after year after year and also do something else is a really different sort of intellectual challenge and different research challenge than thinking about how to get people to start doing reforestation, which will then take on a life of its own and have some benefits and come under some legal protections. And so it's been an interesting scientific challenge for us to start thinking about. So let me tell you a little bit about kind of where we're looking at this. And so the need for reforestation in the Mata Atlântica, or the Brazil's Atlantic forest, is especially dire. Because in the Mata Atlântica, this was the area where the Portuguese landed in around 1500. So it's an area that, depending on how you measure, like how big a patch it has to be forest, it's somewhere that's between about 85% and 90% deforested since 1500. And so that 12 million hectares of reforestation commitment that Brazil's made, most of that is in the Mata Atlântica. And so beyond that, we have this global focus on reforestation. And so to me, the Mata Atlântica is a test bed for how we think about reforestation here, here, and here. So in these yellow areas that were originally forest and are no longer forest. So to me, the challenge of reforestation in Russia and Europe and the United States is a challenge that has to do with industrial agriculture, forest plantations. It has to do with a particular type of economy, whereas the challenge of reforestation in the developing world is a challenge that has to do with non-functioning credit markets, a lack of long time horizon planning, and a lot of transaction costs in dealing with a lot of private landowners. So I see what we're doing in the Mata Atlântica as a test bed for thinking about how we might be able to do reforestation elsewhere in the developing world. So within this landscape, we have the challenges of being in a human-dominated landscape. So we're working within this kind of forest restoration and ecology literature where we know a lot. We know a lot about how you do reforestation if you're hiring a whole bunch of technicians to go out and reforest. We know a lot about how exactly to space the trees, the difference between a 2-meter spacing, a 3-meter spacing, and a 4-meter spacing. We know what happens if you replace the trees, the seedlings that die. We know a lot about the arrangement. We know all of these sorts of things. But the challenges of working in a human-dominated landscape are that you're working in private properties, so you're dealing with multiple landowners, and you're asking them to do something. You're not doing it yourself. So that's the first challenge. In this landscape, the second challenge is that there are relatively low levels of human capital. You're not going out there and providing everybody a month-long training course as a restoration forester before you ask them to do the work on their property. So you need to come up with ways to incentivize and train people that work in areas with low levels of education. The other challenge here is that you have a heterogeneous landscape. You have a heterogeneous landscape from a biophysical standpoint, so I'll show you a little bit about that in a minute. But you also have a heterogeneous social landscape. So you have people who are small family farmers who are reliant on family labor. You have large farmers that have hired labor. You have people who are growing fruit, agroforestry crops. You have people who are ranching. So you have a lot of heterogeneity in this landscape, and so you can't design a kind of a single approach to doing this. And then the last challenge that you have here is the challenge of scaling. So it's really easy to figure out, really easy to figure out how to do reforestation if you have a big plantation. So you can do thousands of hectares of reforestation. If you control an entire area, you've got your greenhouse. So basically everything's happening in one place. But here, if you've got things that are going to, you know, thousands of farmers across a landscape, you have to control all the logistical costs. You have to think about all of the transactions, how you're going to monitor all of these things without sending an individual technician to all of the farms. So you have to think about the things that change when you go from implementing a program with 50 people to thousands of people. So these are our challenges in this human-dominated landscape. So I want to be clear, like anybody should stop me at any moment to ask questions. Please don't let questions like hang out in your head. But at the same time, we have an opportunity in this landscape. So part of our sustainable development goals, part of the arguments about reforestation are that we're going to have some non-carbon benefits of reforestation. And so what our linkage, the way that we're tying into that is following from this work in the World Development Report back in 2008, we're looking at investments in agriculture and investments in agricultural households and farms as a pro-poor development strategy. So if you increase the production in agriculture, this orange line, you dramatically increase the expenditures of the poorest families. So investing in things outside of agriculture increases spending across the range, but not so much in the poorest families. So investing in agriculture is a pro-poor development strategy. And the way to increase income and increase GDP in agriculture is to increase the productivity of agriculture. And so what we have here is we have a graph showing that there's a lot of potential to increase the productivity of agriculture in Brazil in general and in this region in particular. So if you look at the income, so in thousands of reals production per hectare within the Northeast, you have from 100 or 200 reals per hectare to over 4,000 reals per hectare in our box plot here. So you have between the 10th percentile and the 90th percentile. So even if you move people only a little bit up in this distribution, you're going to dramatically increase agricultural incomes. So we have a lot of potential to do that if we can increase the productivity of agriculture. Okay, so in this context, given this, we are designing a randomized control trial, an experiment to pay for reforestation to ask these three central questions. So the first one is whether farmers in a low technology, low human capital landscape, can they implement reforestation on private farms? So are they actually capable of it? So if you go to some NGOs will say no. Some people in the area will say, no, you just can't do it. You have to have technicians doing it. Like, farmers, they just don't know how to do it. So, so that's the first question. And related to that, what are the barriers of them doing so? So this is a region where people actually think forest is a good thing. Why aren't they doing reforestation? And so we're focusing on a couple of different factors. So the first is the perception of, we're assuming that the perception of value of forest is uniformly positive. We're doing some qualitative research, but we're not putting that into the experiment to test. So one of the barriers could be information. They don't know how to do reforestation. When I want more forest on my farm, I don't know how to do it. So we can think about providing information. The second barrier is the ability to pay fixed costs. So if you have to buy seedlings, if you have to hire somebody to clear and prepare the land, it's an expense that you may not be able to fit into your budget. And in the absence of kind of credit markets and other sorts of financial markets, you can't borrow that money. And then the final piece that we're thinking about is the instability of income. So are people limited in what they're able to do because they have such highly variable income month to month? So by providing them a stable income month to month, are we going to let them do things that they wouldn't be doing otherwise? So that's the first question, and that's the kind of socioeconomic uptake question. Then the kind of the first biophysical question is whether we can transfer what we know about active restoration versus passive restoration to farmer implementation rather than technician implementation. So in the forest ecology literature, we know that if you have an adequate seed bank in the soil, so you have an area that is not totally degraded, and you fence it off and keep animals out of it, and just let it sit there and kind of clear all the grasses out of it and just let it sit there, it will regrow forest almost as well as an area where you go in there and actively dig holes and plant seed. But that's with technicians doing the weeding and technicians keeping the animals out and a lot more investment. And so our question here is, do we see the same difference between active and, or lack of difference between active and passive among farmers or not? And then the final question is, do we see environmental and economic co-benefits? And so this is a much longer term question. So do we see the farmers taking any payments that we give them or any benefits that they see on their farm and investing them in increasing agricultural productivity or not? Do we see them changing their activities? Do we see improvements in water access on the land, improvements in other sorts of environmental benefits on the land in the long term? Yes.
How would you define agricultural productivity?
So for my purposes, I'm talking about yield per hectare. So I'm not doing like, I'm not an economist. I'm not talking about like sort of total factor of productivity or anything like that. Because I'm thinking about it from a global land use perspective, I'm talking about yield. Yes.
What are the issue problems?
Yeah,
When I talk to you,
we get
it's
the
not
cacao. It's
a lot.
mostly cacao, so it's mostly cacao. But we'll talk about that more in just a minute. So this is my don't expect a whole lot slide. That's not what I can tell you, but rather what you can tell me, because I have a lot of information about the design and information about the study area and no results yet because I haven't started the experiment, and so I want to hear from you. So this is where we are in this experiment, and I want to talk through it a little bit. So we're spending a lot of time doing social surveys and preliminary data collection for three reasons actually. One, we want to get the baseline data right so we can actually evaluate whether people are changing their behaviors or improving their incomes or any of those sorts of things, and those things are really hard to measure. So we're spending a lot of time thinking about income and production. We are spending a lot of time understanding the heterogeneity in the population, so we're collecting a lot of pre-treatment data to understand the heterogeneity in the population. And there was a third thing, and I'll remember it in just a minute. So right now we're in the middle of a second round of social survey data, and we're going to offer the treatments and offer the payments to people this summer. And that's all I want to say on this slide. I'll come back to some of the other things here later. And so this is our basic experimental design. And so as I said, everyone is going to get information. So I don't have an information treatment and a no information treatment. Everybody's going to get some information about how to do forest restoration. Just somebody asked earlier about control farms. We have 200 control farms here that we're monitoring without actually giving them anything. And what we got here is this full factorial design that's crossing between trying to understand the passive versus the active restoration and the socioeconomic payments. So here, remember I was saying maybe it's that they can't overcome the fixed costs, they can't pay the $500 or so that it costs to do the reforestation. Maybe it's that they need some sort of monthly payment, and the ability to smooth their income will incentivize them to participate. Maybe you need to put both of those things together in order to be able to get some participation. And one of the things that's been really interesting and exciting in this project is working with the NGO that we work with. So, you give people nothing, they won't do anything. You give people $5,000 a month, they'll do anything that you ask them to do for forest restoration. And the interesting part is in the middle. And so we're at a setup now where we don't actually know what's going to happen, which is what makes it scientifically interesting. So we've had debates and arguments within the research team about whether we have to pay the fixed costs or not. So some people are like, they absolutely won't do it if you don't pay all of these fixed costs up front. And some people think that they'll actually be able to cover those fixed costs. And some people think that we have to give them a monthly payment. And some people think that if you just cover the fixed costs, they'll be so happy to have some forest that they'll go ahead and do it. Yeah.
Do the people participating in the study, how do they have to say?
No. So these are going to be randomly assigned.
So there are many farms.
There aren't many farms.
Where does the funding come
Everybody's asking me this question. Where did the funding come from? So there's this guy, and he wrote us a check for $3 million. He gave us a wire transfer for $3 million over 5 years. It's a Nigerian. You see my social security number. No, so it's a private donor. So he funded this. He's just started his own foundation, and the funding is transitioning from being his private donation to being a foundation donation. And so he is a funder who is interested. He's Brazilian, and he's interested in transforming Brazilian science to encourage high-risk, high-payoff, large, ambitious research projects. And so this is actually kind of the flagship project for his new foundation. It's a lot of money. It's a lot of money, yeah.
I have 2 questions. One, are the monthly payments going to be equivalent to fixed costs distributed over the period?
No.
Okay. And 2, why did you try to get rid of the payment in common option, which are monthly payment fixed costs?
Because it was too much work. So I joke. So one, it was too much work, but it was also that it was not, it was a much less clean experiment. So Maya's talking about, so we used to have a monthly payment. We actually used to have a monthly payment, a semi-annual payment, and then an in-kind payment. So we were going to give people technical assistance. But I didn't like how many causal mechanisms that kind of obscured. So I'm interested in, so we had this in-kind treatment, which was a technical assistance package to improve the productivity of either your cacao or your pasture. And I liked it because it went on this kind of hypothesis that if you improve the productivity of your agriculture, it will protect forest and encourage forest protection. But there's so many steps in there that I felt like it was not as clean an experiment. So, so one of the things that I would say to that is that here, we're still trying to figure out, so once we get this basic experiment done, we're trying to decide what to do, what to add on in the second year, if anything. And one of the things that we're thinking there is that for the people getting the monthly payments, we might want to add on some sort of technical assistance or something that would encourage them to invest those monthly payments productively. So,
is there a penalty if they don't do the reforestation?
they don't get any money. The people that get the fixed costs, they don't lose anything. But the people, so the people here, when they're doing they have to weed 4 times a year. So basically there's a condition every 3 months. So there's a condition every 3 months, and if they don't meet the condition every 3 months, they stop getting paid.
Is the randomization household to household, cluster to cluster, or so they could have a neighbor who gets a different offer?
Yes, they could.
And they're not going to do this up?
I don't think so. I don't think so. It's not, okay, this is not Africa, this is not Asia. The community, the people are like dispersed, they don't talk to each other very much. Oftentimes they don't even know who owns a farm next door. It's a really different situation.
But it's long settled or it's recently settled?
Long settled.
Interesting.
It's very odd. It's a very odd place.
Are there
all of these places that you are thinking of.
Are there absentee landlords?
Yes, we'll get there.
Okay, okay.
How are the species that you planted?
Good question. So right now we have a list of 12 native species that are all pioneer or early secondary species. So they're hardy species that are like more tolerant to sun and faster growing and also have more seed availability. So the NGO we're working with specializes in the production of native Mata Atlântica seedlings. So they have like a map of the, in English, the matriarch trees. So they have a map of all of the matriarch trees that they've been working with. And so they have them GPS, they have people that they've trained to go out and collect the seeds. And so they're collecting seeds from these matriarch trees so they know where the genetic material came from. And they have genetic diversity, so they're not all from the same matriarch tree from each species, but it's a set of 12 fast-growing species. So the thing that is interesting about this question is that we were having a debate about whether to have a biodiversity treatment in here or not. So one of the things that we know, one of the things we think we know is that more species, like a more biodiverse set of seedlings to begin with, should be more hardy and should grow better. But we're not actually sure if that's going to be the case. It interacts with the kind of cultural and economic value of the species as well. So we're trying to we're trying to select species that are valuable in some way, but they're not all equally valuable. So like there's some things that people were like, oh, we have plenty of that seedling, and they were like, oh, those are trash trees, nobody wants those. So we're not having those, but we are having species that are sometimes of economic value, sometimes of cultural value, sometimes of aesthetic value. So it's a mix of species. I think we wanted to do this biodiversity thing where we randomly assigned people to get either 4 species, 8 species, or 12 species, and then we randomized which species they got so that the number of species wasn't a specific species treatment. But yeah, that's exactly what we, yeah. Like it's not going to happen because we have to actually collect all the seeds, produce the seedlings, and like having everything ready at the same time and packaged and delivered. It's just too much. So I think everybody's going to end up with the same.
You're going to open a nursery after this process.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about
We're coming to that. We'll come into that. One more question, then we'll talk about the population.
So among those 12 species, does it include the powdery wheel?
Yes, it does. Yeah.
Because it's a very hard tree to grow,
Yes.
you know,
Yes.
and it's absolutely
Yes.
extinct.
Yeah. Yeah, the
Because
Brazil.
The
I'm pretty
tree that's
sure.
named the country is completely.
Let me back up on that. I'm not 100% sure because I think the Pau Brazil is really hard to grow too.
Yeah, that's what
And
I'm
we
saying,
want the-
but you should.
But we want
include.
the yeah, but
It's
like
very
It won't
important
actually grow
for the
trees.
biodiversity and it's economically, you know.
but it's not so tolerant. It's something that has to go after the canopy is already
So
closed.
something that can be established.
It's something that could be a later.
Because the tree is very difficult to be touched.
Yeah.
It's a long
It's
lasting
yeah,
tree.
yeah.
And the reason why it was extinguished was
Mhm.
because of
The
the
wood
color.
is so valuable.
Because
Yeah. yeah.
the color
Yeah.
is red,
Yeah,
so
yeah,
they
yeah.
killed the tree to get the colors and
Mhm.
send all those colors to Portugal,
Mhm.
you know, to taint the sea
Yeah,
from the India and other places, you know, so I think economically it might be interesting,
Yeah,
and
it's an interesting-
historically,
yeah.
so I think you should
Yeah.
give them the overall.
Yeah,
approach.
yeah. Okay.
One
All right.
question
Okay.
from Kenya.
All right. A question from Kenya.
Yeah,
That's
so
awesome.
our colleague Margit, she's curious about the wood usage of households in the region. So are households cutting trees for domestic?
Rarely, very rarely. Yeah, there is not hugely reliable, but there's electricity in the area, and most people use gas stoves for cooking.
Great, so thank you.
All right, let's talk about the. Oh, let me tell you what the passive and active restoration look like, and then we'll talk about the area. So the passive restoration, the big white square. So everything's a 1/2 hectare plot, and it's a 50 meter by 100 meter plot. In the passive restoration, you have to weed this 3 times a year. So you need to mark out 50 by 100, and then you need to weed it 3 times a year. The active restoration is super complicated. Which is because we were trying to do another experiment inside of this. So in the active restoration, you can have 2 50 meter by 50 meter plots, either contiguous or separated to make it a little bit easier to find the spot. And we're testing a plantation reforestation treatment versus an island reforestation treatment. So some results coming out of, I believe, Costa Rica show that if you do this island restoration, it works basically as well as this. And it's substantially cheaper because this is 256 seedlings. This is 100 seedlings in the same area. And so what you do is you plant these islands and you weed everything around them and you weed between the seedlings and these islands, and then as the islands get established, they grow out. Yeah.
How does that impact like the plots that impact?
I mean, these are all basically edge anyway, because this is 50 meters by 50 meters. So yeah, and this is one of the really interesting tensions. It's like, from an ecological perspective, you want this super controlled. Like, from an ecological perspective, you don't want this thing next to this thing because this is not an independent treatment because it's right next to this. And each of these treatments are different depending on whether you put them next to an existing forest patch or in the middle of a pasture. But one of the things that we're doing, because we have so many farms, is that we'll actually be able to look statistically at the effect of where on the, so we'll be able to look where the farmer chooses and then statistically look at the effect of how far these are from an existing forest patch, whether you put these 2 pieces together or not. But the edge effects we're not so worried about because this is basically all edge. So
Maybe a silly question, but how labor intensive is weeding over there? Is it the same as here, like backward weeding, or is there work, or is there, I don't know, equipment used?
There is, so most people are well, I shouldn't say most people. So a lot of people are weeding with weed whackers.
Okay.
The problem is that the weed whackers, if you have any woody vegetation, it breaks the strings in them, and so the people in these areas, they don't actually want to use the weed whackers because there's fallen trees and woody vegetation and rocks, so it's basically manual.
Okay.
But it's not actually, it's not a huge area and it's not a huge amount of work.
Thinking about my yard and what I've collected and not collected.
It is, but your yard might be more than half a hectare.
Yeah,
So-
yeah.
A maximum of 3 months of weeds.
Yeah, yeah, the first one, that's a long one.
Yeah.
So are there any agro-pastoral like that?
That's something people do culturally. Yeah, so the livestock in this area, there are some cattle and there are a lot of donkeys because the donkeys are used in harvesting the cacao. But there are very, very few goats and pigs and things like that, and those are all kept penned up because they're kept to grow for food. So, okay, so let's talk a little bit about the region. I'm so used to talking to people who work in Brazil that I forgot to put the whole Brazil map here. So Bahia is in the northeast of Brazil. The ocean is over here. The area that we're looking at here is, it's a region called the Litoral Sul, and it's the historic cacao producing region of the country. We have selected, there are 451 rural census tracts in this region. It's 26 municipalities. We have 150 rural census tracts selected in our sample. They are, so you can see underlying the orange being selected and blue being unselected is the Hansen Global Forest Cover product. So you can just see forest, non-forest here. So you can see that we have a slight overrepresentation in our sample of areas that have a little more forest. We have an underrepresentation of these areas over here, which are pasture and more cattle ranching areas, because we had a threshold for how many farms per census tract or per census sector would exclude the census sector from the sample. The ocean's over here. There's a rainfall and elevation gradient that goes from high rainfall, low elevation here to high elevation, low rainfall here. That's everything I need to say about the region. Okay, so the area has two mid-sized cities where a lot of people live and a lot of people work. These are cities of 150 to 200,000 people. There is a high level of poverty, a high level of dependence on government programs, not super high for Brazil, but high compared to some other places. So 60% of our households receive some sort of retirement payment from the government. So we have an older population and people getting a lot of government payments. 40% of the households receive some other form of government payment, either a welfare payment or a child-related payment. Among our sample of farms here, the mean travel time to the nearest city is 45 minutes. So the roads are not terrible, but they're not really great. There is, compared to other parts of Brazil, there's a lot less cattle ranching. So less than a third of the farms have any cattle, and even the farms that do have cattle don't have very many. There's more than 2/3 of the farms have cacao. So there's a lot of cacao production. So in case you don't know, cacao is a system where it's an agroforestry system. You plant the cacao, it takes 3 to 5 years to start producing. You have to start replacing the trees at about 30 years of age. So it's a kind of high input perennial system. One of the things that's characteristic of cacao farming is that you have smaller properties than you do when you have something like cattle ranching or more extensive land use. And the other thing that's characteristic of it in Brazil is that it is largely a sharecropping system. So you have people living on the farm who are not the farm owners and are being paid with a portion of the income from the farm. And there's this precipitation gradient from 1,800 to 2,400 millimeters of rainfall per year. So it's all tropical, but there is a precipitation gradient. Okay, so what we were trying to do is we were trying to get 3 interviews before we offered them the treatment. So we started with, when we were doing the selection, we actually had to go out and census the farms in the census sectors that were selected because there was no list of them, so to select the sample. So we started out with that. The first survey we did, which I'm showing you results from now, is the Land Use Production Income Demographics Survey. We were aiming for 3,000 farms. Some of our census sectors had high non-response rates, so we ended up at 2,991. We're right in the middle of doing this, or actually we're 85% of the way through doing this survey on cognitive function and risk preferences. If you want to hear about that, I'm talking about it tomorrow at the Population Center. So we're doing this, the cognitive function risk preferences, and then we're starting in April to go and do a series of updates to try to understand a little bit more about the production systems, a little bit more about income, any changes to the demographics of the farm, and then offer the people who are going to get the treatments, the program starting in April, with an aim to start planting seedlings in the active restoration during the rainy season, which starts probably in May. It was really late last year, but we're hoping it'll be on time this year.
Do you have a permanent field staff that just goes from task to task, or how does it work?
We have 17 people that we employ right now that
Locals
are
or outsiders?
locals. There's one guy from Portugal, and but he's lived in the region for like 20 years, and the rest of them are recent graduates with degrees in agronomy from the local state university.
So you give them like a multi-year contract or 1 year contract?
I think we're giving them a year-to-year contract. I mean, the labor laws are a little different, so basically, like, they're permanent employees until we get rid of them, and then we have to pay some horrible severance things. So, not horrible for them, but
Yeah.
we have to pay more money than we would if we let someone go here. But so basically, they've been employed full-time since we started this kind of field visits and census part. And once we finish the offer of the program, then we'll keep a subset of them to do some of the follow-up activities, but we won't need all of them the whole time. They're paid very well too. By Brazilian standards, they're paid very well, which I actually feel really good because they're paid well, and they're also, in Brazil, a lot of things go by the title of your job, and so we gave them job titles that are researcher job titles and not like census taker job titles, and so we're actually contributing to their development as well as training them in how to do sampling and training them how to do interviews and focus groups. And so my hope is that this has a positive effect on them. So we'll see. So this is what the farms look like. Sorry, some of this is in Portuguese. So how big is the property? So you have this crazy right-skewed distribution of property sizes, which is really different than a lot of other places in Brazil. It's different than a lot of other places in the world. It's concerning for the uptake rate, because you might imagine that if you have a half a hectare, you want somebody to reforest half a hectare. Those people who have, the range here is from 2 hectares to 300 hectares, because those were the boundaries that we set. And if you've got 10% of the people who have 4 hectares or less, it's going to be really hard for some of those people to find a half a hectare to reforest. Even if you let them have 2 quarter-hectare plots in different places, it's going to be kind of challenging for them. So we're expecting the uptake to be kind of low on that end. We're expecting the uptake to be low here too, because if you have 300 hectares, you really probably can't be bothered to do anything with half a hectare. It's just, extra effort for you. So we're really interested mostly in what's happening here in the middle, and how small is too small to ask people to do this. So, we know that the uptake is going to be really, really low for the people who have 2 hectares, but I want to know kind of at what point does the uptake start to increase again. So the things that we're looking at that we're expecting them to do the reforestation on are pasture and areas that have some sort of secondary growth. 69% of the farms have some pasture, 44% of the farms have some secondary growth. So you can see that there are going to be some people who are going to have a hard time finding any land that doesn't have their house or their cacao on it. And so it's going to be hard for those people as well. So all of these are things we're going to figure out as we start offering people the program. The farmers often rely on hired labor. So this is also a challenge, because the program that you're offering and the payments that you're offering are to the owner of the farm. But the person who's actually going to have to do the work is the permanent worker who lives on the farm. And so one of the things that's going to be interesting to see is how people organize that. So we did some pilot tests with the active restoration, and in some cases the farm owner said, okay, well, sure, I'll ask, this guy here if he wants to do it, and if he wants to do it, we'll do it, and if he doesn't want to do it, whatever, we won't do it. And in some cases the owner said, okay, definitely we'll do it, but then the worker just never got around to it, so it never happened. And in some other cases the owner said yes, and then the worker just did it. So there's different relationships there that are really interesting. So a lot of the places have permanent workers, and those permanent workers include both salaried workers and sharecroppers. So in addition to that, more than 40% of the farms contracted temporary labor in the last year. So one of the things we found in the pilot test is there seems to be actually a scarcity of labor in the rural area here, which is weird because it's paralleled with a really high unemployment rate in the local cities, because a lot of youth have moved to the cities, and so there's a mismatch there. So cacao is the dominant productive land use, but there's a lot of other things going on in the landscape. There's not a lot of them, like, you know, there's a kind of very heterogeneous other set of activities. So a third of the people produce bananas for sale. A lot of other people have bananas that they use just to shade the cacao trees. People are raising ducks and chickens. People are raising pigs. Some of them are raising cattle, but they're relatively small herds of cattle. And so to me, this is the place that I'm looking for the opportunity for what to do in that kind of second year treatment to improve people's productivity. What can I do to say, the payment that I'm giving you, how about you buy, you know, 20 chickens with it and raise some chickens, or how about you buy a goat or something like that? So, okay. So as I said, the young people have been moving to the city, so the median owner is 59. So these owners are relatively old for farm populations. The education, the mean is 8.5 years. So they have some formal education, but not a great deal of formal education. But they're very small households, so there's not a lot of surplus family labor here, which is one of the assumptions that I went in with, that there would be a lot of surplus family labor, but there's not. The median income is 1,700 reals per month. It's a very skewed distribution, very, very long right tail, some of which is measurement error, because I don't think anybody's making like $20,000 a month. So this is like about $500 a month. Just for comparison, the minimum salary, so the minimum wage in Brazil right now is, like, if I'm not remembering incorrectly, 880 reals a month. And so this is a relatively good salary or good income for rural households. So 35% of those households, more than half of their income is from retirement income. And more than 40% of the households, more than half of their income is from agriculture. So these folks, you might imagine, are not going to be swayed so much by the kind of stability of the monthly payment, because they're already getting a stable monthly payment. These folks who are getting income once a year, even if their income is higher, the stability should be an attraction for them.
My question is, is that the income of the landowners, or?
That's the income of the landowners, not the workers. We had a lot of debate about what we should do with the workers, because in theory, I would love to interview all the workers and know a lot of things about them, because when you think about the landscape and who's on the landscape, the future of the population, you want those people. But it's a payment program, and so I need to like actually have everything be about the decision maker. And I didn't have enough money to interview, you know, like an extra 4,000 people.
I think like some people will really be persuaded by the money, and other people not care as much. I'm wondering if you something about providing information about that, just kind of give that information about like the relational benefits, how the money.
No, so we're providing information about how to do it.
So I wonder if providing some people might be swayed more by, oh, if I do this, and then pollinators, that might have water restriction, sales, you know, people don't care as much about money. Might be, and you can then see is money more people, is like ecological benefits.
Yeah, and maybe actually do so one of the things I've been trying to think about is kind of like, once we get all of this first year implemented, what to do in later years. And it might actually be interesting to do with like the folks who refused. So we'll still follow up with them to see, you know, what their lives are like in the next couple of years. And so maybe in the second or third year, we'll say, hey, remember how we offered that program? Like, look at these data and graphs on how, you know, how many more pollinators you have and how much more water, and, you know, would that actually work to improve?
They also help identify risk factors for non-participation.
So we're working a little bit right now, doing some focus groups, which should happen in the next 2 weeks, to talk about what the barriers are and why people wouldn't want to do reforestation. Because at least anecdotally, everybody's like, forest is good, we need more forest. So, all right, cool. Okay, so a few more things about the owners and the horrible heterogeneity in the population that's hard to deal with. So 42% of them live in the city. These are not your typical absentee landlords. So you can see of that 42%, 28% of them are going every day they're reverse commuting from the city to their farm to go do some farm work. And more than half of them are, so 65% of them are doing that at least every week. So this isn't an absentee landlord. This is somebody who's actively involved in the management of the farm, but just happens to live in the city because there's schools there that are better and their kids can get to them, or they need some health care or something like that. And so there's a small number of them, 10% of them that visit less than monthly. Some of these are truly absentee landowners. We had some folks in our sample who live in Switzerland. We have some folks in our sample who live in other parts of Brazil. So a lot of them are living, so that small number of them are living in other places, a lot of them are visiting pretty often. So one of the things that we were thinking about doing with the implementation is a lot of focus on the implementation of these sorts of programs has been through cooperatives or unions or some sort of association. So we asked them, does anybody in your household belong to any sort of union or association? And only a third of them, the households, participate in any sort of cooperative activity. And so that to me says that's not the way to do reforestation and other sorts of programs in this landscape. So the other piece I've mentioned to a number of people is that one of the reasons to do reforestation is that by law you have to have 20% of your property in forest. The only penalty really to not having 20% of your property in forest is that you don't get subsidized agricultural credit. And so I was interested in whether people have used agricultural credit or tried to use agricultural credit in the past. And I was also interested in whether they effectively had no property rights because they were so indebted in their property. So there was a big crash in cacao prices about 20 years ago, as well as an invasion of a fungus. And so every kind of the bottom fell out of the cacao market. A lot of people were over leveraged and are now kind of underwater on their farms, basically. And so I was interested in how many of these people, so the 34% that have used agricultural credit, how many of them just failed to pay it off? And so effectively, they're going to lose their farm if anyone ever gets around to repossessing a farm. So, because to me, that's effectively an insecure property. Yes.
So the definition of owner, Marie is curious, is that somebody with title deed?
No.
No.
It is someone who identifies themselves as an owner. And so what that means, so we ask them what sort of title or deed or thing they have. And so I don't have that number here. I remember right about 40% of them had an official title, and the other ones had various types of papers that range from a little signed receipt from the previous owner. So if you get land granted from the government, there's this long process that you have to go through. And so if you're in the middle of that process, you have a thing that's a document with a stamp on it, but it's not an actual title. So,
Yeah, so I know that like a major impediment to investing in like planting more trees, not having a title deed for land grabs. So that's something you're gonna look at.
it's something that I'll totally look at. I've looked at the effects of land title in other places, and it's never mattered anywhere else. I've looked in Brazil.
Oh,
In Brazil, it's a huge thing in Africa. So my take on it is that informal land ownership, like land rights and land markets, are strong enough that having a formal title doesn't actually get you more than the informal. So
No,
yeah.
that is easy from what
No, there is no. The rental market virtually non-existent. So, and actually, it's a very, very land rental markets are very poorly developed in Brazil as a whole, and in this region in particular.
I'm gonna put a couple of questions for now.
I know. I'm watching the clock too. Okay. All right. So quickly. So these are just some kind of basic facts about people. One of the things that we were interested in was cell phones, because one of the monitoring strategies that we want to use is cell phone photos of the reforestation plot after you weeded it to prove that you actually weeded it. And so, holding up the day's paper or something like that. And so a lot of people have cell phones. So I talked about the experimental design. We talked a little bit about the possible second-year additional treatment. We talked about the 2x3 matrix. We talked about the possible embedded biodiversity treatments. The one other piece that I wanted to put in here is that one of the things we're considering related to the cell phones is cross-cutting this, a random assignment to people getting text messages or not text messages to remind them every 3 months that they need to weed. So that's one thing that we're considering. We talked about that. I'm going quickly because I have the shiny thing coming that I want you to see. So thinking about this kind of in the long term, what we're going to evaluate. So in the short term, what we're doing is we're looking at differential uptake and we're looking at first year attrition. So you might have noticed that there were really large numbers in those cells. We had 300 farms getting each offer. And the reason we have 300 farms getting each offer is that even if we have kind of 50% uptake rate, I want to have enough people left to look at something later. So like I want to know if 50% of the people take it up and then 10% of those people drop out each year for 3 years, what's happening at the end? And so I need enough people in the box to begin with to get there. So in the short term, we're looking just at differential uptake by treatment. We're looking at first year attrition. So I'm assuming there'll be a bunch of uptake and then a bunch of people who drop out before the first weeding, and then like lower attrition after that. So longer term, we're interested in a couple of things here, and I've highlighted or bolded attrition and the biomass and the reforestation plots. And so the attrition piece that I want to think about is I really want to understand the mechanisms underlying dropping out of this program. So it'd be one thing, I could come back, I could pay people for 3 years or not pay people for 3 years, and then I could just be like, this person dropped out, this person didn't drop out. But what I really want to understand here is the feedbacks from the performance and the feedbacks from the species and those sorts of things. So it's like if I give you some kind of tree that you really like and all those seedlings die, are you demoralized and totally drop out of the program? Or if if you have the passive restoration, does that mean that you're going to be more likely to drop out of the program because you see it as doing nothing, as opposed to planting the seedlings, which is doing something? And so some of the differences between the deforestation and the active and passive restoration are going to be because of these human feedbacks. And these are the pieces that I'm particularly interested in. And so that I'm going to try to get at in our annual interview surveys. And then the other thing that we're looking at is biomass and the restoration plots. So instead of sending someone out at the end of 3 years to compare the plots and the different treatments to say, to send a technician there to count the seedlings and all of those sorts of things, what we want to do is some sort of remotely sensed measure of biomass so that we can compare all of the plots in all of the treatments to each other. And so what we're working with on that is, we'll get there in just a second. So this is what I just said. So the measurement challenges here. So we were talking about the attrition. We have to measure the feedbacks. We're going to do that in interviews, measuring the success of the reforestation. I'm going to come back to this question about the control in just a minute if we get there. And we're thinking about the biomass as the key outcome. And this is my brief digression into the shiny thing. And so this is, we're trying to use LiDAR to measure the biomass. So for those of you who don't know, LiDAR shoots a whole bunch of lasers, measures the return time, and then what it can do is it can give you a sense of the structure of the forest. It can see under the canopy. So what we've done in the kind of preliminary data collection is we focused on LiDAR measurements in existing secondary growth forests to try to parameterize the relationship between biomass measured on the ground and LiDAR-based measurements. So this outline in yellow is a state park that was established in the region about 20 years ago. This outline in purple is a big square that we flew with this airplane with a LiDAR thing mounted on it, shooting lasers down. This is what it looked like out of the window when my colleague was in the airplane. And so what this does is we now have the largest and densest contiguous LiDAR data set in Brazil. So we have about 100 points per square meter. And so what you can see with that is, so this is a kind of cross-sectional view. So you can see the ground and you can see the trees above the ground. And we have such density of points that you can see the trees, the kind of extra tall trees that go up above the canopy. So you can see a whole bunch of really cool things. And we did on the ground biomass things. That's one of our postdocs. He's really tough. Thinks he's really tough. And so we did on the ground field measurements in these little squares here. And then we related those field-based biomass measurements to, you can relate it to a bunch of parameters from the LiDAR. But what we have here is the 90th percentile of the LiDAR returns. So this is kind of the 90th percentile of all of the heights within a given pixel. And related then to the above ground biomass measured by that field survey, obviously not measured by cutting all the trees down and burning them, just the field survey measurement, which has its own errors. And so we have a really nice relationship here. Okay, it doesn't go here. So this is our next challenge, because when we're looking at our restoration plots, they're going to be all over here. So we have this really nice relationship here, and what we've shown is that we can actually fly the LiDAR, we can actually analyze the data. It's really useful, and so we can. So we're going to try to figure out sometime in the next 2 years how to measure much smaller trees and the biomass of much smaller trees using the LiDAR, and how to come up with enough money to pay for it. So we're kind of betting on the LiDAR getting a lot cheaper, because right now it's very expensive to buy. Okay, so 5 minutes to 5. All right, these are my like closing questions. You don't have to answer any of them. You can answer them over a beer if you want to. But I kind of wanted to hear your thoughts on things like, what should I be thinking about in the short term across the different ecological treatments? So we've got this kind of long-term focus on biomass. Is there anything else that we're missing? Like, what do you think that I should like have thought about, or should have thought about? And then the kind of scaling question of, what do we do to take this kind of thing somewhere else? Do I have to run? The economist I work with, he's like, okay, I want to get somebody else to give us $3 million more, and we're going to run this thing in the Amazon. Do I need to do that? Or can I take the lessons learned in some other way to some other place? So, any thoughts?
Probably have time for about 2 or 3 questions.
Not questions, responses. You have to answer my questions.
Yeah, answer the questions.
Sam has an answer.
I have answered that question. So you said earlier in the talk that this study site is in many ways different from the rest of Brazil in terms of the distribution of properties and what's being grown, and yet you keep talking about scaling. And so I guess I'm confused. Like, if this is an unusual site within Brazil, who are you to think that you can scale what you learn from this?
It takes some chutzpah to ask a guy to write you a check for $5 million. So that's who I am. So this relates to the conversation we were having earlier. So my response to that is that the key piece of information we're learning here is not how much money you have to pay people or the particular species mix that you have to give people. The thing that we're learning here is whether in an environment in which you are credit constrained, insurance constrained, there's a lot of volatility in the market, all of those sorts of things, are you primarily limited by fixed costs, by consumption smoothing and monthly payments? And we're also learning this piece about whether farmers are actually able to implement the active versus the passive. And those are all lessons that I think are generalizable.
But if you take this to Hodonia, and there's more cattle ranching, say,
yes,
maybe people aren't credit constrained, or maybe they are. I mean, how applicable are the lessons that you've learned here to other states where the agricultural economy is different?
So I think that the basic lessons are applicable. I think that so my personal answer to this question is what I would need to do is do much smaller, more refined experiments in other places just to kind of verify the results. But I think that related also to the point that you were making about causal mechanisms, the things that I see about the attrition and the reasons for the attrition from year to year are going to tell us a whole hell of a lot that will be generalizing to other places.
Question for that. May I just join that discussion? So just to disclose, I'm Brazilian, so I'm here because I love trees and I plant a bunch of trees around here, and by a coincidence, my daughter is a plant biologist and she's in her PhD in South Dakota. So the point that I would like to make is, and it's much more my opinion than anything, is that, let's say you just said, try to put that in the Amazon forest. It depends very much on the boundary of the forest and the economy where they meet. And for this, I think it's a fantastic research. But if you think about expanding to Amazon, the particularities of the deforestation in the Amazon are a little bit different because it's being invaded by agricultural things and by crops, growing animals and things like that. So we have to, you would have to see how the ground is and maybe restructure all your knowledge to a different setting, but it does not exclude these possibilities.
I think that's right, but I think that's more, it's a little bit more of a scaling issue because it's about the opportunity cost of the land. And so, sorry, okay, it's time to stop talking.
I just
No,
want to
stop
let
talking.
Let's finish.
Oh, yeah, please finish.
Okay.
I just want to. Oh, yeah, I was just gonna say, like, I think this is awesome research, really interesting, but I just want to feedback on, like, well, I come from more of, like, a ecology background, and there's a lot of emphasis on, like, history and the social, cultural aspects, and, you know, the preferences and priorities of people are going to differ wildly based on where they're living, the relationship with them, their gender, and so it seems like, and this is like a situation in which it seems like people are fairly well off, and it's just a different economy and everything. So I would agree that I think, well, on one, I guess, you know, how are you going to look at like the social cultural context, how do you look at that? And then in terms of scaling, I would think that people would have very different ideas about forest reforestation and different incentives based on where they live, their poverty level, their livelihood. So like how, I don't know.
Yeah, so we haven't been able to look at that yet, so that's what we're doing, these focus groups that are hopefully happening in the next 2 weeks. So, you know, we have 8 focus groups across the kind of different axes of heterogeneity within the population so that we can look at these questions of, you know, do the cattle ranchers think fundamentally differently about forest and reforestation and such than about organization and production than the people living in agroforestry cacao regions, and, you know, do older people or younger people, people from the region, not from the region, how do those vary?
All right, so if anybody wants to join us at happy hour, we'll be going to Might as well. That's okay with everyone who's joining for happy hour, but if you have any other questions you'd like to ask Dr. VanWey, please, you're absolutely welcome to join. Thank you guys all for coming out.